The Pale Blue Eye. The Pale Blue Eye is a mystery thriller movie based on the novel of the same name by Louis Bayard. The story is happening in 1830 in West Point, New York, and begins with a man in the woods washing his hands in the cold water. He hears the sound of a trumpet calling out nearby his cabin, and when facing the guests, we learn that his name is Augustus Landor, and Captain Hitchcock is there to inform him that he has been summoned by the Superintendent Thayer of the United States Military Academy for an audience. He accepts immediately, and during the ride, the captain mentions the remarkable achievements that the detective acquired during his career, which didn't go unnoticed even by the governor. Landor remains cold to the praises. On the contrary, he adds that the notes don't contain the fact that his daughter ran away. When getting to the actual point, the captain and the colonel reveal that he was called to investigate a crime, the hanging of one of the cadets, Leroy Fry, whose heart was carved while the body was in the hospital ward. When Landor comes to see it, Dr. Marquise, who was in charge of Fry's autopsy, mentions that the heart was cut out very carefully so that no damage is caused to it, and when asked, says that a heart can be preserved in a container and surrounded by ice. This procedure requires a strong hand, most likely a man's hand, but not necessarily a specialist as a doctor or surgeon. Landor accepts the mission. He then goes with Hitchcock and another cadet named Huntoon, who was on guard duty on the night of the crime, to see the place where Fry hanged himself. The cadet explained that he heard a noise and ran to help, but he saw Fry hanged in an unusual position, like sitting on a chair, with his feet touching the ground. When inspecting the body more attentively, Landor notices that the bruise on the neck is not straight, but instead as it runs up and down, like he was fighting against it, his fingers showing the same battle. At the back of the neck, Dr. Marquise finds a significant contusion which altogether leads them to the conclusion that Fry was murdered. Another clue is a scrap of note paper found in his fist, the content of which will be deciphered later. Hitchcock then asks for Landor's discretion and sobriety, and the investigation begins. A young cadet approaches Landor and only confuses him by saying that the murderer is a poet. Landor then approaches Private Cochran and asks about the time when Fry's body was transported to the hospital. The man says that nothing happened until he was released from his duty by one officer who didn't identify himself but had the bars on the left shoulder missing. In the evening, he enters a tavern where he orders a drink and engages in a talk with the innkeeper woman, Patsy, who points out to the young man sitting in the corner of the tavern, who is the same cadet that approached him and said about the poet. He presents himself as Edgar Poe and explains that the heart that was stolen represents a symbol, and a poet would be best qualified to do this act of savagery. The way Poe speaks and puts the facts on the table impresses Landor. At his incentive, the detective interrogates another two cadets, which disclose that Fry has fallen in with a bad bunch, and on the night of the murder he didn't carry a rope or any other weapon with him. In the meantime, Landor and Hitchcock learn that in Cold Spring, a cow and a sheep have been murdered and mutilated by having their hearts carved and removed. Landor meets up again with the young Poe and offers him employment, and after accepting, the detective asks him to decipher the note that was found in Fry's hand. Later in the night, in Landon's cabin, flashbacks appear of a young, beautiful blonde girl spinning around and smiling, which makes us believe that she is either his daughter or his late lady wife. He is awoken by Poe's knocking on the door that came to share what he had learned. Together they conclude that the person who left the note for Fry is a woman, and Poe remembers that he saw a woman of unspeakable beauty that day. In a few days, Poe finds a note from Landor to meet him at Lake Courage by the ice house. There they discover another crime scene where the room served as some sort of religious ritual for the hearts that were stolen. They head together to Professor Jean Pepé, an expert in symbols and rituals, who tells them about a witch hunter named Leclerc, who managed to secure the secret of immortality. He also tells them that witches used for their Sabbath feasts unclean animals and the hearts of hanged men. Poe then manages to infiltrate the cadets and find out that Dr. Marquise's son Artemis has an affinity for the occults. He receives an invitation from Artemis and is introduced to his private peer group, one of which is a cadet named Bollinger. During their meeting, Poe finds out that Artemis's sister had a connection with Fry. At Fry's funeral, his mother hands his son's cipher diary to Landor. He is also meeting Dr. Marquise's wife, who seems a troubled woman. Poe is invited to the Marquise's house, and there he meets Artemis's sister, Lee, and instantly feels in love and asks her for a walk at the cemetery. The walk has a positive outcome until Lee starts coughing and collapses into a seizure that puts Poe in a challenging position. After parting, Poe is attacked on his way back by Bollinger, who threatens him to stay away from Lee, but fortunately he is saved by Landor. In a few days, all cadets are being summoned to search for another disappeared colleague, Bollinger, who is, of course, found dead in the mountains, hanged, castrated, and with his heart carved out and stolen. Dr. Marquise observes that Bollinger's heart is not dissected as cleanly as Fry's, which can only mean that it was performed by another hand. They start to suspect Poe, but when Landor questions him, he is assured of his innocence. Landor and Poe are invited for dinner to Dr. Marquise, and during the time there, Artemis insults both of them, causing a violent reaction in his mother. Dr. Marquise also confesses to Landor that his daughter has been ill since she was little. He then uses the moment when everyone is distracted and searches Artemis' room, where he finds that officer's jacket with the missing bars on the left shoulder. He doesn't get the chance to hear a confession from Artemis as they are interrupted by Hitchcock, who comes to alert that another cadet, Stoddard, has gone missing along with all his belongings. It is written in Fry's diary that all three of them, Fry, Bollinger, and Stoddard, were close friends. Landor sees the portrait of Leclerc, the priest who turned out to be a devil worshipper that the professor told him about in Dr. Marquise's house, and is finally sure of their guilt and involvement in the series of murders. Confronted, the doctor confesses that he couldn't help his daughter and didn't deny her help from the dead. Lee contacted the dead that now speaks to her, and to prolong her existence, offers them sacrifices. In the next scene, we see Poe enchanted and tied up to the table and bleeding, but still alive and surrounded by a blood circle, and the Marquises performing their ritual. Fractions of seconds before his heart is cut open, Landor bursts in and interrupts their actions. The candle fire extends and eats the whole room, and the detective manages to save Poe and Mrs. Marquise right before Artemis and Lee get swollen by the flames. His mission is then over. When coming to his senses, Poe visits Landor and puts him in a completely different light. That note the detective wrote to meet him by the ice house has the same writing as the one found in Fry's hand. Also, the woman at the tavern where Landor used to drink, Patsy, told him a story of Landor's daughter. She was raped by 3 men on her way home and then threw herself off the cliff. He learned later that one of their identities was Fry by one necklace his daughter had after the abuse, and forcefully hanged him, a fact covered unintentionally by the Marquise family, who only took the heart from the dead body. The cow and the sheep were killed to support the idea of serial murderers. Bollinger was discovered because of Fry's diary, and Landor performed the dissection after the victim confessed himself. Stoddard, however, managed to escape by running, and Landor says he has no will or strength to chase him down. Listening to him, Poe empathizes and ends up burning the note that could incriminate the detective. When turned to leave, Landor alludes that it would have been great if his daughter met him instead of the other 3, showing his deeply appreciation for what kind of man Poe is. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and press the subscribe button.